The great American writer at the end of the 19th century, Mark Twain, once said, "For the most part, it ain't what we don't know that hurts us. It's what we know for sure that ain't so." So the question becomes, how can we know for sure what we think we know that isn't so? Now that takes understanding, doesn't it? What is understanding? Does this sound like a strange question to you? Because with all the problems we have in the world today, is it possible that part of the answer is that many people simply do not understand what is understanding? The conflict in the Middle East continues with children being killed on both sides. In neighboring Syria, the regime has killed more than 30,000 of its own people. Some of you are probably thinking, well, maybe people actually understand all too well, but simply disagree. But look how much misunderstanding there exists in the world today. The lack of understanding that has led to high divorce rates of over 50% of all marriages. The lack of understanding between races and nations, where it seems that people's egos get in the way because of some people's idea of understanding seems to be that every other person on earth must agree with them. It's the attitude of my way or the highway. And that, my friends, is because of ego. Ego is certainly a big problem in today's world. How do we get the egos out of the way so that we can truly begin to understand one another? Ezra Taft Benson once said that pride is concerned with who is right, while humility is concerned with what is right. And humility has often been called royalty without a crown. Is it not a lack of understanding of other people's cultures, of other people's religions, of other people's politics that's at the root of many of our problems? If we could all come to admit that a lack of understanding is the cause for many of the world's problems, then we could begin to recognize the importance of a proper definition of understanding. What would the world be like if we could all get the opposing parties to agree on what understanding truly is? What if our definition of understanding was based on humility? In other words, I'm not at all concerned with who is right, but more concerned with what is right. Would we not be able to create a much better world? Even on an individual level, the lack of understanding of one another causes many problems. What if our planet could come together in agreement on a definition of understanding that has humility built into it? But first, I need to give you a quick background on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the great civil rights leader of the United States, who helped eradicate much of the violence and injustice perpetrated on black Americans during the mid-20th century. This prejudice was the result of some people's hatred against fellow human beings merely because of the color of their skin. Did you know that genetics tells us that only one gene mutation changes the skin color from black to white? Did you know that only one gene mutation changes the color of our hair and the kinkiness of our hair, makes it straight or curly? One gene mutation, that's the only difference. How sad it is that some people judge other human beings with so shallow a reasoning. Dr. King was praying that the day would come that all human beings would be judged by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. Dr. King said this: "Men often hate each other because they fear each other. And they fear each other because they don't know each other. And they don't know each other because they cannot communicate. And they cannot communicate because they are separated." Did you notice the last part of that final sentence? It's extremely interesting insight by Dr. King. This ties in with a book that was written more than 50 years ago by the great psychologist Carl Jung, the co-founder with Sigmund Freud of modern psychology. In this book is a key to a better understanding of one another. In October of 2009, more than 50 years after his death, the family of Carl Jung finally decided that it was time to publish this unusual book. It's called The Red Book. His family had kept it hidden more than 50 years. And the question is, why did Carl Jung's family refuse to publish this and prefer to keep it hidden for more than 50 years? Carl Jung penned each page to look like a scroll from the Middle Ages. The Red Book also contained many mandalas. These are colored drawings that Jung made of a series of remarkable dreams that he had in the early years of the 20th century. So his family, knowing the strangeness of this book in comparison to his other works, decided not to publish it. Why not? Because they were afraid it might damage his reputation as a serious thinker and scientist. The theme of the Red Book is one of earthwide importance, especially now in the age of the internet when communications are instantaneous in our global village. We live in an age of jet travel, where the world has shrunk. We live in an age of fundamentalist extremism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. We live in an age where the countries in the Middle East, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, have and are overthrowing dictatorial regimes with attempts at forming nascent democracies. It turns out that Carl Jung's book is being released at just the right time, because it asks us all the great questions that concern world leaders that have to deal with these emerging new governments. What is the great question that is the major issue of our time? Is it not the same message that Dr. Martin Luther King mentioned in the quote I gave at the beginning? Human beings have trouble communicating because they're separated one from another. Carl Jung states the theme of his Red Book when he asks this question, the question that can lead to the solution of many of the world's problems if we had the knowledge to implement it. Jung asks the questions in two parts. Number one, what is the great gulf that separates us one from another? And two, what is the bridge that can connect us? Let me repeat that because it's an extremely powerful tool. What is the great gulf that separates us one from another? And two, what is the bridge that can connect us? Now you can probably think of many things that separate us. Language, culture, certainly religious differences between Jews, Muslims, and Christians. But also within religions we have different sects that divide us even within those denominations, don't we? But can we sum up or generalize all these differences in one word? What is the gap that separates us from one another? Is it not a lack of understanding? Language, cultural differences, religious differences could all be summed up as a lack of understanding, couldn't it? The best definition of understanding that I've ever read comes from the realm of philosophy. It was first described by the great philosopher Immanuel Kant in the 18th century. So here's one very important key that could change your life, give you better communication skills with your wife, your significant other, better understanding of your children and your neighbor, and a better understanding of other nations. Listen carefully, as this definition of understanding appears to answer problems that come up in the theme of the Red Book. What is the gap that separates us one from another, and what is the bridge that can connect us? Immanuel Kant's definition of understanding is this. It's Carl Jung's bridge that can connect us. Immanuel Kant said this, understanding is essentially the faculty of judgment, and it is always discursive. Understanding is essentially the faculty of judgment, and it is always discursive. Now, I like this definition because it comes in with a built-in humility. When Kant says that understanding is essentially the faculty of judgment, he means that when we tell someone that we understand something they've said, what we're actually saying is that we've made a judgment about what that person has said. And we either agree with it or we disagree with it. But either way, we've judged the statement. Do you know what the definition of faculty means? It's an inherent mental or physical power, an aptitude or talent for doing something, a capacity for understanding. So it means the ability to make a judgment. Now we can't forget the last part of that definition, because Immanuel Kant also said, and it is always discursive. Understanding is essentially the faculty of judgment, and it is always discursive. Now note that this is the clincher. We all know what cursive writing is, don't we? Where you're writing on a blackboard, it's all writing that's connected as you're writing. But printed writing in books or magazines is disconnected, or non-cursive writing. What this means is this. All of us needs to be humble, because we need to understand that sometimes we don't understand something or someone, sometimes our children, sometimes our neighbors, sometimes other nations. And the usual reason why is because we have discursiveness on our part. In other words, we're missing a piece of the puzzle, perhaps many pieces of the puzzle. We have gaps in our knowledge. We have to have the humility to admit that. Let me drop this bombshell on you. I recently attended a meeting with the Carl Jung Society, And I asked 3 top Jungian societies that were there, Dr. Marie Jensen, Dr. John Allen, and Dr. Joan McGregor. I asked them, what is the great gulf that separates us one from another? All 3 answered the same thing. It is what Carl Jung called our shadow side. The shadow side of human nature that we project onto others, our fellow human beings. We make others the enemy. We project onto them our suspicions, the things that we hate in ourselves. On a subconscious level, our prejudices, our envy, our anger, things we don't like about ourselves, we project onto others. Carl Jung considered his explanation his greatest discovery, the discovery of the dark side, the shadow side. Can't we see that this definition comes with a built-in humility? Pride is concerned with who is right, while humility is concerned with what is right. Remember that. Surely we can all admit we have gaps in our knowledge, but that's what it means to be human. So if it's not our ego preventing us from understanding, then it's gaps in our knowledge. Ego and pride is another reason for lack of understanding. The great Russian writer Leo Tolstoy, author of War and Peace, explains why this happens. Leo Tolstoy recognized that the role of the individual ego and pride in human nature. He said this, I know that most men, including those at ease with problems of the greatest complexity, can seldom accept even the simplest and most obvious truth, if it be such as it would oblige them to admit the falsity of conclusions of the things they've delighted to explain to colleagues, which they have proudly taught to others, and which they have woven thread by thread into the very fabric of their lives. So what about this old and new definition of what is understanding? If we can all admit that we have gaps in our knowledge, that if we do not understand another person, it just could be because we're missing a piece of the puzzle, or that our puzzle looks quite different than the other puzzle board that the other person is playing on. Well, what do you mean by that, Pastor Sampson? The answer is found in the truth about how our brains evolved. Did you know that the human brain rarely thinks new thoughts? What it actually does is that it takes any new information and tries to apply it onto the tree of knowledge that already exists on the brain. It tries to slot it in. And this is the main reason why we may have a lack of understanding. This is the most crucial thing we must understand before we can truly understand anything else. The brain evolved as a pattern recognition organ. And that is the key to human survival and for all of us to understand one another. Now, this is the subject of a future broadcast, how the brain actually thinks. I hope you will tune in. Until next time, goodbye, friends.